From WisPolitics in Madison, you're listening to Capital Chats.
Good afternoon, and welcome to Capital Chats, brought to you by Spectrum. I'm Joshua Irvin, a reporter with WisPolitics. Over the last year, Republicans and Democrats across the country have moved to redraw their congressional maps in a race to out-gerrymander each other ahead of the November midterms. Wisconsin is in the midst of its own years-long redistricting saga, with two ongoing lawsuits seeking to change the state's current maps and, following Governor Evers' failed push for a constitutional amendment barring gerrymandering, the possibility of another mid-decade redistricting effort by Wisconsin lawmakers. This week, I spoke with Robert Yablon, a UW law professor and the faculty co-director of the State Democracy Research Initiative. We broke down the status quo and discussed what the future holds for Wisconsin's congressional maps.
Rob, thank you for joining me.
Glad to be with you.
Let's start off. Let me ask you, does Wisconsin currently have fair maps?
Well, if we're talking about the congressional maps, there are cases right now in which litigants say that we do not, right? I mean, Wisconsin is a 50-50 state in terms of our statewide elections, right? If anything, Democrats have won more of those statewide races in recent years than Republicans, and yet our congressional map has, for the last couple of elections, it's been a 6-2 Republican map. And so if your measure of fairness is some kind of proportionality, then it might seem to you that something is a little bit off. Another measure potentially of fairness that is being brought up in one of these pending lawsuits in Wisconsin refers to the anti-competitiveness of our maps. And it's less about whether the maps are a pure partisan gerrymander, but rather whether they allow or invite competitive elections. And the reality is, in the last couple of cycles, in terms of congressional races, only one of our 8 districts has really had closely contested races. And so, if another measure of fairness is, do you have reasonably competitive maps that could swing one way or the other, depending on, what the particular political year brings? Our map also doesn't perform particularly well, it seems, on that measure. So, those are a couple of indicators that maybe we could do better than our current map. I will just say, our state legislative map was a map that was considered to be one of the most gerrymandered in the country from 2011 through the 2020 redistricting cycle. Now, we did get a new state legislative map in 2023. That map was in place in the first time in 2024, and that map has resulted in a much more closely divided state legislature than we had. And it's a map that could well give the Democrats an opportunity for the first time in quite a while to potentially win a majority this year. So, we have moved in a more competitive, more symmetric direction in our state legislative map. And again, we do have these current cases right now where litigants are arguing that we should kind of move in a similar way with our congressional map as well.
Okay. I'm taking all of that, where do you see Wisconsin fitting in this sort of broader rush to gerrymander in both red and blue states across the country?
Yeah, I mean, we are in the middle of what's a pretty unprecedented mid-decade spurt of redistricting activity. Normally we expect redistricting to happen after a census. Maybe there's some litigation that happens, but by the time you get to the middle of the decade, there's usually not much going on redistricting wise. But what have we seen over the past year? We have seen this surge of activity starting about a year ago when President Trump suggested that Texas should redistrict to try to squeeze a few more Republican seats out of Texas. And then California responded, and California voters approved a new map that was going to counter the Texas gerrymander. And then you have a number of states that have followed on. And, we may be looking this year in 2026 at having 10 to 12 states using different congressional maps than they used in 2024. And that's really unusual. And most of that activity has been activity where the map makers are pretty brazenly, admittedly engaging in gerrymandering. They're trying to skew their maps in favor of one party or another. Wisconsin has not to date gotten involved with that, right? The maps that we're going to use in 2026 are the same maps that we used in 2022 and 2024. But the likelihood is that the activity that we're seeing in 2026 is going to continue into 2028 as well. I mean, where things stand right now is that the Republicans seem to be ending up with a little bit of an upper hand in terms of the 2026 activity. The dust still needs to settle a bit, but it may be that we end up on net with about 10 more Republican leaning districts than we had before. And so that's going to create a lot of pressure on Democrats, I think, around the country to try to, counterpunch in 2028. And it may well be that Wisconsin ends up being kind of swept into that activity, right? And that could happen either because of the ongoing lawsuits, or it could happen if we end up with a Democratic-controlled legislature and a Democratic governor after the 2026 midterms. I suspect that there would be a fair amount of pressure from national Democrats to redo the congressional districts and try to get, 2 or 3 or 4 more Democratic-leaning seats in Congress.
Okay, talk to me about how that would potentially work, starting with that kind of trifecta situation.
Yeah, so what might happen if there was a Democratic trifecta, as I said, given the fact that it looks like the Democrats are going to be a little bit behind after the 2026 activity plays out, there may be a push from the national Democrats in Congress or elsewhere to get the state legislature moving on a new map. So that's where a map would have to start, right? The legislature would have to design one, pass one, and it would go to a governor to sign. Maybe there would be litigation about such a map, unclear at this point. First of all, there are a lot of contingencies here, right? I mean, one contingency is, would we have such a Democratic trifecta, right? That a lot of uncertainty about whether that might happen. That would be a best case scenario for the Democrats. Second, if they wanted to redistrict, how aggressive would they be in that redistricting? Right? Would they try to adopt a map that really a lot of people would agree on as being just a fairly even-handed map, say a map that is likely to give you a 4-4 congressional delegation, or a map that's a highly competitive map that in a good year for Democrats could give them 5 or 6 seats, and in a good year for Republicans could give them 5 or 6 seats, right? If that happened, maybe you wouldn't even see that much litigation about it. But the other thing that could potentially happen is maybe the Democrats really feel compelled to counter gerrymander, right? To counteract what's happening in terms of pro-Republican gerrymanders elsewhere, and really more aggressively go for a map that's going to lean to, say, a 6-2 Democratic map. And if that were to happen, then it wouldn't surprise me at all if we saw some litigation where now the Republicans are arguing that that is an impermissible gerrymander under state law. So, Wisconsin is a place where there's at least the potential for quite a bit of redistricting related activity between 2026 and 2028.
And what role, turning back to those lawsuits, how do those potentially impact the future of Wisconsin's maps?
Yeah, so, if there is not legislative change, then those lawsuits likely present the best opportunity for the current maps to be redone in some way. So, there are 2 lawsuits right now. They have slightly different legal theories. One of those lawsuits is a partisan gerrymandering argument, right? It says that the current map violates the Wisconsin Constitution because it constitutes a partisan gerrymander, and presumably the remedial map in such a case, if it were successful, would be a map that might be more of a 4-4 map in sort of in an unusual year. The other case argues that the current map is not a partisan gerrymander, but an anti-competitive gerrymander. So as I said at the beginning, one where there just aren't really a lot of competitive congressional races right now. And so if that case were successful, the remedy might be a map where you had more districts that could reasonably swing one way or the other depending on the year. And so, either way, if those cases are successful, and that's a big if, you could end up with a map that looks different from the current one, that may swing a couple more seats to the Democrats, but the court is not likely to produce a map that would be a counter gerrymander, right? It would likely be only through legislative action that there would be a likelihood that the state would really swing in the other direction and have a map that's likely to get, say, 5 or 6 districts that are truly Democratic leaning districts.
And we spoke briefly on the phone the other day. You told me that partisan gerrymandering case could even go so far as to potentially kneecap a more aggressive Democratic gerrymander of the our congressional maps.
Yeah, if that case goes forward, and if the Wisconsin Supreme Court says that in fact there is a right to partisan fairness in our congressional maps, then that would be a decision that would constrain a future legislature from adopting an affirmative gerrymander one direction or the other. Now, I would say that what would likely happen if we had legislative activity, if there was a new map that was legislatively adopted, technically that would probably moot these current cases and it would require someone else to bring a new case, right?
So,
Where they might then challenge the new map as a gerrymander.
gotcha. So the a new legislative maps would render the litigation moot and not the other way around.
Uh, that's yes, right. So if there's because the current cases are challenging the current maps, and so if the maps change, then those cases would essentially go away. But it depends a little bit on the timing here. If there was a holding from the Wisconsin Supreme Court that there is a right to partisan fairness that prevents partisan gerrymandering, if that were to happen, that would then constrain any potential legislative action in the future. So, the effects of the litigation versus legislation could sort of run, the timing could run either way.
And when we spoke before, you noted that the attorneys who are, arguing in the partisan gerrymandering case are also attorneys who have generally represented Democrats in prior cases. Does this put them in a bit of an awkward situation? Is there is a Democratic trifecta going to potentially affect the arguments that they make before the Supreme Court?
Potentially, right? So as I said, there are these two cases, and the case in which the theory is this partisan gerrymandering theory, yes, those lawyers are lawyers who are often representing Democratic Party and Democratic affiliated causes throughout the country. So could they be put into an awkward position if there's a Democratic trifecta and the Democratic Party is suggesting that we should have a pro-democratic gerrymander? Yes, and unclear what would happen in that case if they would continue to push for partisan fairness, or if they would drop the case, if the case became mooted, if they would just sit it out. Right, it is a little bit of an awkward position for them to be in, arguing in court right now for partisan fairness, but possibly having some of the people who they're closely aligned with pushing for again kind of a counter gerrymander, where you would get a pro-democratic map in Wisconsin to counter some of the pro-republican maps that you're seeing in other states.
All right. Rob, thank you very much for taking the time.
Yeah, happy to do it.
Plaintiffs in both the partisan gerrymandering and anti-competitive gerrymandering lawsuits have filed notice indicating they plan to appeal their cases to the state Supreme Court, after a pair of three-judge panels separately rejected both cases last month. The court has not yet indicated if it will hear either case. Thank you again to Rob, to Spectrum, and to you, the listener. I'm Joshua Irvin with Wiz Politics, and this has been Capital Chats.